You're looking to get a handle on the big, complex issues shaping our world, right?
Yeah, but, wading through tons of reports,
Yeah.
it can be a lot.
Totally. That's where we come in. We do those deep dives for you.
We pull out the essential stuff, the surprising bits, so you can get up to speed, efficiently.
And today, we're zooming in on a really key year, 2015.
Right, looking at it through this incredibly thorough resource, the Indigenous World 2016 report.
It's put out every year by IWGIA, the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs.
Yep, in English and Spanish. And it covers basically everywhere. So many countries, so many different issues facing indigenous peoples.
It really is a massive amount of vital info. But let's be honest, who has the time to go through all that?
Exactly. So our mission today, we're going to guide you through it,
We'll pull out the key developments, the good stuff and the ongoing struggles.
giving you a clear snapshot of the global indigenous landscape back in 2015, rolling into early 2016.
Think of it as your shortcut to understanding some really important global dynamics. Okay, let's get into it.
Yeah, what's really interesting diving into this 2016 report is you see the seeds of so many things we're still talking about today. So
Yeah.
maybe let's start with some of the positive shifts, because there were definitely encouraging signs happening in different places.
Absolutely. Like, take Tanzania. The report mentions a noticeable change in attitudes towards FGM, female genital mutilation,
Yeah, and it wasn't just random. It came from sustained awareness work.
by indigenous peoples' organizations themselves, right?
Yeah.
Highlighting the health risks, the social impact.
Exactly. And they mentioned these secondary education scholarships for girls, too, as a way to protect potential victims, a really concrete measure.
That's a great example, isn't it? How community-led efforts can make a real difference on the ground, tackling these really deep-rooted practices.
Definitely. And then shifting over to India, there was a significant legal step forward.
Oh, yeah, the amendment to the Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes Act, that was important.
Very. It specifically made assault or sexual exploitation of an indigenous woman a crime.
And crucially, it defined it broadly, didn't it? Not just physical acts, but also like non-consensual touching, words, gestures.
That kind of specific legal language is just, well, it's vital for accountability, for real protection.
It really is. Okay, so Canada, the report talks about a potential turning point there.
Yeah, with the new Liberal government coming in, they made this big commitment.
To implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP.
Right, which is, the key international standard. Self-determination, free, prior, and informed consent, all that.
And the Prime Minister pledged to reset the relationship.
It really felt like potentially a new era was starting.
Definitely a shift in tone, at least. And down in the United States, we see this kind of interesting split, right, between different levels of government and indigenous nations.
Yeah, that's quite striking. On one hand, you had states making deals.
Like in Washington state, with the Suquamish and Squaxin Island tribes.
Exactly. They reached agreements with the state government to sell recreational marijuana under state law.
Which suggests maybe that state law felt safer or more practical for them than federal law at the time.
Seems like it, yeah. In that specific situation, anyway.
A surprising kind of twist in how sovereignty was playing out. But then at the same time, a big win at the federal level.
A really big one. Regarding the Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA.
Tell us about that.
Well, the U.S. District Court in South Dakota ruled for the Oglala and Rosebud Sioux tribes and Native parents.
Finding the state had violated ICWA and foster care placements.
Yes, and the report really stresses the shocking numbers. Native Americans are maybe 9% of South Dakota's population.
But over half the kids in foster care were Native.
Just staggering. So this ruling was crucial, affirming tribal sovereignty, trying to stop the unwarranted removal of kids from their communities.
Absolutely vital for
Right.
families, for culture. And something else happened under Obama too, right? The Keystone XL pipeline.
Ah, yes. President Obama rejected the permit.
And while there were many reasons, the report notes it acknowledged the huge protests.
From Native people in South Dakota, yeah. Deeply concerned about it crossing ancestral lands, treaty lands.
That decision must have resonated hugely.
Oh, definitely. Seen as a major win for environmental protection, for treaty rights. Okay, let's shift focus to Guatemala. Two really positive legal precedents mentioned there.
Yes, good examples of the legal system eventually working, maybe after a long fight.
First, a court ruling for the Maya Achi community.
Ordering their community registration be reinstated.
Right. setting a precedent against municipalities basically trying to strip away indigenous rights.
That's important groundwork. And the second one,
The Constitutional Court canceled this incorrect private registration of a state farm.
which was actually on ancestral Quechua territory.
Exactly. So it gave the community a real chance to reclaim their land after, a long legal battle.
Shows what persistence can achieve, even when facing big legal hurdles.
Definitely. Okay, Panama. A significant step towards maybe reconciliation.
The government agreed to compensate the Guna de Madamgandi and Embera community.
Yes. It was fulfilling a ruling from the IACHR, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights.
Ah, right. Recognizing their rights were violated way back by the Alto Bayano hydroelectric dam.
Built in 1972. So a long time coming. It really shows the importance of those international human rights bodies holding states accountable.
And making sure there's some kind of redress even decades later.
And another Panama case, the Supreme Court ordered the eviction of non-indigenous occupiers.
From the Embera Comarca, their territory.
Yeah, from the Sambu area. This came after an investigation into an earlier ruling, so it showed some follow-through on upholding indigenous land rights.
Good to see rulings being enforced.
Mm-hmm.
And the report also mentioned some really impressive teamwork, right? Like in Venezuela.
Well, this is remarkable. A joint effort between Yanomami organizations in Venezuela and Brazil, the Haranami and Hutakara groups, working together across the border. Exactly. With help from socio-environmental groups, they published the first binational map of Yanomami and Yukwana territories.
Wow, that's powerful. A physical map of their shared ancestral lands.
A huge tool for asserting their connection, for advocacy. Really impressive.
Absolutely. And even in places with big challenges, we see these little sparks of progress, like Taiwan.
Yeah, the parliament there approved a bill, financial compensation, basically.
For prohibiting development and logging on indigenous reserved lands.
Right. The idea was it would help protect forests and support indigenous livelihoods. Kind of a win-win attempt.
Trying to balance conservation and rights? Makes sense.
And in Indonesia, the report notes this growing trend. More regional laws recognizing and protecting indigenous peoples.
Like in Lebak and Bulakumba districts in 2015.
Yeah, encouraging signs of action happening at the local level, even if the national picture is complex.
Shows that local government can make a difference. And finally, on the positive side, peace agreements.
Right. In Morocco, between Eufora and Imgad tribal leaders in Nefi.
And another one in Mali, between Tuareg and Arab communities.
Now, obviously, these are conflict zones, and peace is a long road. But these agreements, these local agreements, are vital first steps. A glimmer of hope, maybe?
Essential building blocks. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's some of the progress needed. But the report also makes it very clear.
Yeah. Alongside the good news, there were huge challenges and serious concerns persisting right across the globe in 2015.
Unfortunately, yeah. That's the other side of the coin. Where should we start? Maybe Greenland.
Okay, Greenland. The report points to these, fundamental structural problems. Aging population, decline in GNP.
And the government was trying things, right? Boosting business, education.
Yeah, but facing criticism, too, about sort of random taxes on fisheries, the backbone of their economy.
And a lack of transparency.
Exactly, which led to Transparency International Greenland being set up. Shows you the level of concern about openness.
Right, civil society stepping in. Okay, Norway. The Sami reindeer herders.
A difficult situation there. This 2007 Reindeer Husbandry Act was forcing them to reduce herd sizes.
And the herders felt their own knowledge wasn't valued.
Pretty much. They felt their traditional understanding of how to manage the herd sustainably was just ignored.
And that it infringed on their rights. Property rights, self-governance.
Yeah. It raises that big question, doesn't it? How can governments work with indigenous communities, respecting their traditional knowledge and resource management?
Instead of just imposing rules. Good point.
Yeah.
A next door in Finland.
Still hadn't ratified ILO Convention 169.
Despite saying they intended to.
Yeah, a long-running issue. Ratification would be a big formal step, legally recognizing indigenous rights there.
Still waiting on that one. Okay, Russia. Concerns there about political motives.
Yes, specifically the retrial of Sergei Nikiforov. He'd protested against mining licenses from the Petropavlovsk group.
And human rights groups like Memorial and Amnesty called him a political prisoner.
They did. Which signals serious worries about freedom of expression, especially for activists challenging powerful companies.
A risky business. And another issue in Russia, a sacred lake.
Within Numto National Park, yeah. Threatened by plans to change park boundaries for oil extraction.
Just disregarding indigenous land rights for resources?
A classic and very worrying example of that pattern.
Sadly familiar. Okay, back to Canada. There was a report mentioned in bad faith.
Right. It basically challenged how effective Canada's Specific Claims Action Plan was. This plan was meant to resolve historical grievances from First Nations.
But the report said,
It concluded the previous government had pretty much given up on real negotiation as the way to settle these claims.
wow, that suggests a lot of frustration.
Deep frustration, yeah. Raised serious questions about the government's actual commitment to reconciliation at that point.
Okay. And in the U.S., another interesting story with the Menominee tribe in Wisconsin burning their marijuana crop.
Yeah, it's kind of counterintuitive, isn't it? But despite what's happening in Washington state, they had reservations.
About selling to non-Indians and where the seeds came from.
Exactly. And they were worried about federal law enforcement stepping in.
Just shows the complexity, doesn't it? Navigating these different, sometimes conflicting legal systems.
Definitely illustrates that patchwork. Okay, moving south, Nicaragua, the Mega Canal Project, still a huge issue.
Right. And the Black Creole indigenous community of Bluefields felt they weren't consulted.
Not genuinely consulted, no. They even accused the government of setting up a kind of parallel government structure.
Just to push the canal through.
That was the allegation, yeah.
Yeah.
A real breakdown of trust.
Very serious stuff. And Costa Rica, they had ratified ILO-169,
But the report makes it clear, rights were far from fully respected or implemented.
well, what kinds of issues were ongoing?
Oh, a whole list. Ongoing discrimination, social exclusion, less public money going into indigenous territory,
Invasion of their lands by outsiders.
lack of legitimacy for their own administrative bodies, denial of the right to be consulted. It's stark.
Shows ratification isn't enough, right? You need real implementation.
Absolutely crucial. And the report also mentions dialogue spaces that had been set up, just kind of fizzled out.
And indigenous rights weren't really a priority in national policy.
Plus, the Inter-American Court had issued precautionary measures for the Salida indigenous peoples because they were facing violence and aggression.
But the violence continued anyway, burning homes, crops.
Yeah, deeply disturbing. It just highlights how precarious things were.
Okay, Colombia, widespread discontent there with President Santos's policies.
Yeah, the core issue was this kind of contradiction,
Pushing a peace deal on one side.
while also pushing this extractivist economic model. Privatization, things like the Zydress law.
Which the report says damaged indigenous and Afro-Colombian ancestral territories.
Right, these special economic zones, often about resource extraction, often bypassing consultation.
A classic tension we see everywhere, isn't it? Economic development versus indigenous rights.
Absolutely. And the report points out Colombia's low ranking in global competitiveness indexes. Things like weak institutions, lack of public trust, corruption.
Suggesting broader governance problems.
And the fact that agreements already made with rural sectors weren't being implemented, that fueled more protests, a lot of dissatisfaction.
Right. Venezuela now. Land demarcation issues.
Big issues. The Constitution guarantees demarcation of indigenous lands, but the report says progress was incredibly slow.
So indigenous groups were calling for action.
Urgently, yeah. KIOIM, the main Amazon Indigenous Coordinating Body, demanded a review and an action plan. There was a real frustration.
And specific examples, too, like coal mining.
Yes, Decree 1606 expanded coal mining in Guajira, directly impacting Wayuu communities, their water sources.
Early to protests.
Big protests. And eventually, the decree was amended to reduce the area, but the threat was clear.
And illegal mining was also a problem.
Yeah, by Colombians, apparently, in the Ventuari River Basin, impacting Yucuana and Sanama communities. An ongoing threat.
Okay, Ecuador. Another place with a constitutional tension.
Exactly. Recognized as a plurinational state, acknowledging multiple nations within its borders.
But the government was pushing a social capitalism economic model.
Which led to clashes, misunderstandings with indigenous peoples, worries about protecting their cultures, their territories.
A fundamental conflict in vision. Peru next. Legal action against a specific law.
Yeah, Law 3230. Indigenous organizations and civil society groups appealed it as unconstitutional.
Worried it would harm indigenous rights and lands.
That was the concern. And what raised eyebrows was the long delay by the Constitutional Court just to even admit the case.
Suggesting maybe political influence?
That was the suspicion, yeah. The report also notes that presidential candidates weren't really talking much about protecting natural areas or tackling corruption or illegal wildlife trafficking.
Important issues getting sidelined. Concerning. Okay, Bolivia. A reduction in indigenous political representation.
Yeah, a noticeable drop in both national and regional elections. That's worrying for ensuring indigenous voices are actually heard.
And changes to consultation rules.
Yes, Decree 229815 amended the process for hydrocarbon projects on indigenous lands.
Raising concerns, it weakened rights, like the right to information, participation, free, prior, and informed consent.
Exactly. Undermining FPIC, essentially. And the report also mentions divisions within indigenous organizations.
Which can make unified advocacy harder.
Yeah, it certainly can.
Yeah.
Sometimes external actors can exploit those divisions. Okay, Brazil. The Shammai report mentioned a doubling of cases.
Of neglect and delays in regulating indigenous lands.
Yeah. And Shammai linked this directly to government development projects, like the huge San Luis do Tapajós Dam proposal.
Which threatened to flood massive areas of indigenous land.
Exactly. And then there was PEC 2152,000, this proposed constitutional amendment.
A major threat.
Huge. To lands already demarcated and those still waiting for demarcation, potentially affecting tens of thousands of people.
Just trying to roll back rights, essentially.
That's how it was seen. And you also had ongoing struggles like the Ayurio communities fight to get their lands legally measured, facing disputes with cattle ranchers.
A persistent battle. Argentina next. Protests in the capital.
By the Qom community, yeah. Demanding return of ancestral lands, justice for past violence, highlighting that ongoing fight.
And the trial of an indigenous leader, Relmu Diamku.
On attempted homicide charges, linked to a land conflict, raising fears about criminalizing indigenous resistance.
And the report pointed out a disturbing pattern in the justice system.
Yeah, justice being really slow for indigenous victims of rights violations.
But often very fast when cases are brought against indigenous people.
Suggests a real bias. And the arrest of the India Quilmes community leader for trying to reclaim a sacred site that had been taken for economic use. Another example of that problem.
Deeply concerning. Okay, Chile. A critical human rights situation there, too.
Yeah, mainly due to conflicts over land and resources. And again, the lack of proper implementation of ILO 169.
Especially that key part, free, prior, and informed consultation.
Exactly. It just wasn't happening adequately. And proposed changes to the water code and a new bill on biodiversity and protected areas.
Both raised concerns about indigenous rights and participation.
Yes. And then on Rapa Nui, Easter Island, this co-administration proposal for the national park was seen as totally inadequate.
Leading to protests.
And the criminalization of Rapa Nui leaders who were just advocating for their community's rights.
Even in places like Australia, challenges persist, right?
Yeah, the report mentions ongoing issues and suggests the new Canadian Commission on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women should consult Australian Indigenous groups because the problems are sadly similar.
And concerns about things like income management. Maintaining control despite talk of sustainable development.
Right, a potential gap between the official words and the reality on the ground.
And Aotearoa, New Zealand. Persistent gaps between Maori and non-Maori.
Huge gaps, yeah. Life expectancy, income, education, incarceration rates, still a major issue.
And worries about the Maori language bill amendments.
Concerns about clarity, the Crown's role, how it would actually be implemented. Protecting indigenous languages is a constant struggle.
Plus, UN bodies raising concerns.
Yes, the Committee Against Torture and the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, worried about violence against Maori women and their massive overrepresentation in prisons.
And other issues, too, like hate speech legislation, history textbooks.
Yeah, failure to pass anti-hate speech laws, and criticism of a revised textbook passage about the Ainu in Japan, seen as whitewashing history.
All pointing to a continued need for greater recognition and respect there.
Definitely. Okay, shifting to Asia, China officially recognizes 55 ethnic minority groups.
But there are others who aren't recognized.
Right, these unrecognized ethnic groups.
Yeah.
And the report notes a, well, more authoritarian approach in areas with ethnic tensions like Tibet and Xinjiang.
More media restrictions.
Yeah, and reports of violence in Xinjiang, protests in Guizhou over land compensation for minorities.
A complex picture. Taiwan, we mentioned progress, but also ongoing debates.
Around indigenous hunting rights, yeah. A real tension.
Between traditional culture, gun control, wildlife conservation.
Exactly. Different groups, police, religious organizations, animal rights groups, all raising concerns. Shows how tricky it is to balance these things.
And the whole issue of indigenous autonomy still needed work.
Yeah, lots of negotiations still required on how to actually implement it.
Okay. The Philippines. Persistent, severe problems there.
Very severe. Corporate mining, unregulated small-scale mining, hydro dams.
Leading to displacement, environmental damage, conflict.
All of the above. Plus, increasing militarization of mining areas, violence against human rights defenders.
And those forced evacuations of Lumad communities. The massacre in Surigao del Sur.
Just horrific, a tragic example of the extreme dangers indigenous communities face when defending their rights and lands.
Truly awful. Indonesia, constitutional recognition, court rulings, but
Yeah.
still issues.
Yeah, the government was still arguing the concept of indigenous peoples doesn't fully apply there, which creates obstacles.
And criminalization and violence continued.
Persisted, yeah. Not much sign of improvement, even if some conviction numbers dipped slightly. And specific cases, like the Tanda Ai people in Flores facing eviction threats, land disputes dragging on.
That gap between law and reality again?
A critical, widespread problem there. But on a slightly brighter note in the region, the Indigenous Peoples Network of Malaysia, JOAS.
They were actively engaging with Parliament on land issues.
Yeah, proactive efforts, a good sign.
Okay. And quick mentions for other Asian countries. Thailand.
World Heritage Committee deferred listing Kong Krachan National Park due to concerns about indigenous communities there.
Cambodia. Still using ethnic minorities instead of indigenous peoples.
Largely, yeah. In law and media, not fully adopted the term.
Vietnam. High poverty rates among ethnic minorities persisting.
Despite national progress, yeah. And a new poverty standard was expected to actually increase the rate for minorities because of limited access to basic services.
Laos. Voted for UNDIP but doesn't recognize indigenous peoples domestically.
Correct. The UN called on them to acknowledge and guarantee rights and actually engage them in decisions.
Burma, Myanmar. Ongoing conflict despite ceasefire talks.
Yeah, still impacting human rights, especially for the Rohingya. And reforms weren't really reaching ethnic minorities effectively.
Bangladesh doesn't recognize indigenous status either. And the CHG Accord.
Still not fully implemented. Key parts like demilitarization, self-government, land dispute resolution lagging.
And increasing violence against indigenous women and girls, often linked to land.
Alarmingly so, yes. With a culture of impunity for perpetrators.
Just a devastating overview across Asia. So many complex challenges.
It really underscores the diversity of issues, yeah. Legal recognition, conflict, development impacts.
Absolutely. Okay, let's turn to Africa. Also significant challenges reported. Nepal first, technically South Asia, but often grouped here. New constitution led to protests.
Widespread protests, yeah. Indigenous peoples and Madhisis denounced it as discriminatory, violating human rights standards.
India, again, laws exist, but implementation is poor, and the term indigenous isn't accepted.
Right. Plus, ongoing rights violations by security forces in conflict zones. Very low recognition of community forest rights.
And eviction threats for conservation, with little compensation.
That too. Morocco, the issue of Amazigh lands taken during colonization, still unresolved. Considered state land now by the government. And Amazigh language education still limited.
Mali, ongoing insecurity in the north and central areas.
Due to fighting, yeah. Severely impacting livelihoods, access to basics.
Burkina Faso constitution doesn't recognize indigenous peoples, and impunity for violence.
Especially against pastoralists. Forced displacement, camps burned, no accountability.
Cameroon indigenous peoples not effectively involved in development affecting them.
A lack of meaningful participation. Central African Republic, the Mboro and Uka, disproportionately hit by conflict. Yes, hindering any protective measures. Democratic Republic of Congo accepts the concept of indigenous peoples, Ubudi Baka Batwa.
But no specific laws or policies to protect them.
Not yet. And incredibly long delays for the Batwa of Kahuzi-Biega seeking justice for their land rights.
Kenya, conflicts in Turkana County over oil and land.
Raising concerns for the Turkana people's rights and well-being, plus a lawsuit over land for the Lake Turkana wind power project.
And slow progress on implementing the Endoroy ruling from the African Commission.
Disappointingly slow, yeah. Uganda, ongoing violations against the Bene people after eviction from Mount Elgon Park, including rape, violence, lack of government response, just awful.
Rwanda, the Batwa recategorized as historically marginalized.
Yeah.
Still the poorest group.
Yes, following expulsion from their lands. Tanzania, we heard about FGM progress, but also land grabbing and conflicts. Several cases mentioned, yeah. Affected groups like the Maasai. But also, positively, the formation of an Indigenous Peoples Task Force on Climate Change, TIPTCC, engaging internationally.
Namibia's Sand people still facing challenges despite some recognition.
Yeah. The launch of the Namibian Sand Council was maybe a positive step, but the white paper on indigenous rights wasn't really moving forward.
And Botswana hardship continues, especially in the Central Kalahari Game Reserve, but maybe a slight shift.
A potential softening. A meeting between the president and a representative of the First People of the Kalahari was noted. A small sign, perhaps.
Wow, like another huge sweep. Just underlines the sheer scale and complexity of the issues across Africa in 2015.
It really does. Isolated progress here and there, but massive systemic challenges and rights issues remained widespread.
Okay, finally, the report looked at international processes and advocacy.
Right. The Indigenous Peoples Major Group was heavily involved in the post-2015 Development Agenda, the SDGs.
But many of their key concerns didn't fully make it into the final documents.
Unfortunately, no. It highlights that constant struggle, doesn't it? To get Indigenous perspectives truly integrated into these global frameworks.
Definitely. The Paris Agreement on Climate Change acknowledged Indigenous peoples' role.
Which was welcome, yeah.
But the report also warned about potential false solutions to climate change and the need for strong safeguards in things like the Green Climate Fund to protect Indigenous rights and lands.
Absolutely critical. Can't solve climate change by creating other injustices.
Good point. The report also stressed the role of UN treaty bodies, like CERD and CRC.
Monitoring human rights treaties, yeah. And paying more attention to Indigenous rights specifically, using UNDRP as a guide.
Issuing recommendations to countries on land rights, FPIC, consultation, language preservation.
These bodies are crucial for holding states accountable and promoting Indigenous rights globally.
And the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, what was their focus?
Implementing commitments from the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, the 2030 Agenda, and also, sadly, the very high rates of youth suicide in Indigenous communities, bringing attention to that crisis.
And the World Heritage Center made a significant move.
Yeah, deferring decisions on sites affecting Indigenous peoples if they hadn't given their free, prior, and informed consent.
Aligning with a policy emphasizing Indigenous rights in the heritage process.
A positive step. And finally, the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights specifically looked at Indigenous peoples' rights in relation to business activities.
Which is so important given the impacts of things like mining.
Absolutely. So these international processes, they can be slow, complex, but they are essential for advancing and protecting Indigenous rights worldwide.
So wrapping up this deep dive into the Indigenous World 2016 report, it's clear 2015 was, well, a real mix.
Definitely. Some important steps forward in places, but also just deeply entrenched struggles continuing across the globe.
It paints this really complex, multifaceted picture, doesn't it? Encouraging legal wins or political shifts in some spots.
Juxtaposed against the ongoing reality of discrimination, violence, threats to land and culture, and so many others.
It really just hammers home how vital strong laws are, how crucial the advocacy work is.
By Indigenous organizations and their allies, yeah. And the need for sustained international cooperation. It's all part of the puzzle.
Which kind of leads to a final thought for you listening. You know, considering how interconnected all these global issues really are.
What role can we as individuals actually play in supporting the rights, the self-determination of Indigenous peoples, wherever they are?
It's something to think about, isn't it? We really encourage you to dig deeper, check out the Indigenous World report itself, look at resources from IWGIA and other groups.
Keep learning, keep engaging with these incredibly important issues.